I think some unauthorized reprinting of my comments are being distributed right now. I don't know who all those people are that are passing them out. I'd like to begin by thanking the Lord for giving me the opportunity to participate in this conference. Of course, not unlike the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, this expression of gratitude, though sincere, should not be taken literally in every detail. Specifically, I use the term the Lord to refer not to God, but to a significantly less holy trinity that we all know to exist, namely the three Mikes who organized this conference. Mike the Murray, Mike the Ray, and Mike the Holy Bergman. Holy there is spelled W-H-O-L-L-Y. I would also like to thank Eleonore Stump for her willingness to stick her neck out tonight. Well, again, not literally, on what is obviously an extremely difficult problem for someone with her religious beliefs. Professor Stump's approach to the issue of the character of the biblical God is as nuanced as it is thought-provoking. She refuses to ask how we should interpret the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, because she recognizes that the plausibility of an interpretation is relative to the beliefs of the interpreter. For example, for Christians who believe the Bible to be not revelation itself, but just a fallible human report of revelation, it would be foolish to take seriously the idea that a morally perfect God literally commanded the Israelites to slaughter the Amalekites. This is why Stump conducts a thought experiment. She asks a question not about the actual world, but about a putatively possible world in which the central claims of her particular version of Orthodox Christianity, which I will call Eleonorean Christianity, are true. In this way, she hopes to enable us to see the story of the Amalekites through her eyes, and thus to appreciate why her interpretation of the story is plausible for someone with beliefs like hers. Second, Stump wisely refuses to discuss problems of evil that are not uniquely biblical, such as the problem of why God allows horrific suffering, even if those problems are raised by the story. Instead, she limits her attention to problems like why God commands one people to destroy another, problems that Eleonorean Christians face only because they believe that the Bible is divinely inspired. Taking these nuances into account, we can describe Stump's project as follows. She wants to offer an interpretation of the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, and she wants to make at least three claims about that interpretation. First, she wants to claim that her interpretation takes the story to be literally true in its entirety. We can call this the literality claim. Second, she wants to claim that accepting her interpretation does not require Eleonorean Christians to reject any deeply entrenched moral beliefs. Let's call this the morality claim. And third, she wants to claim that her interpretation of the story is plausible for Eleonorean Christians. Let's call this the plausibility claim. After briefly summarizing Stump's interpretation, I will challenge all three of these claims about it. In so doing, I will also implicitly challenge a fourth claim that she wants to make about her interpretation, namely, that it solves all of the uniquely biblical problems of evil raised by the story. A key component of Stump's interpretation is that the purpose of God's command to exterminate Amalek is not to punish Amalek for what it did to Israel when Israel came out of Egypt. For that would involve punishing innocent Amalekites, not to mention their animals, and so would be unjust. Instead, God's purpose, or at least one of God's purposes, is to form Israel, the people or nation, interestingly, not the individual Israelites, for union with himself. The obvious objection is that if this was God's purpose, then God failed miserably, for the Bible reports that Israel turned away from God shortly after the destruction of Amalek. How could an Eleonorean God, a God who is both omnipotent and omniscient, be so inept? Stump responds that this and many other apparent failures reported in the Bible might themselves be required for successfully forming Israel for union with God. The Israelite people might need to learn by firsthand experience what doesn't work in order to be willing to freely accept what does. Stump's first claim about this interpretation is that it takes the story of Samuel and the Amalekites to be literally true in every detail. Part of what she means by this is that, on her interpretation, the entire story, including its theological elements, is a historical narrative and a perfectly accurate one at that. I agree that on her interpretation this is so, but I still want to challenge the literality claim. To begin to appreciate why, consider what, according to Samuel, are God's own words. Quote, "I have made reckoning of what Amalek did to Israel, that he set against him on the way as he was coming up from Egypt. Now, go and strike down Amalek, and put under the ban everything that he has. You shall not spare him, and you shall put to death man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." In this passage, God states a rationale for his command to exterminate Amalek that is very different from the rationale Stump attributes to God. Of course, the passage doesn't explicitly say that what Amalek did to Israel a few generations before Samuel was born explains what God now wants Israel to do to Amalek. But an Eleonorean God would realize that such an interpretation of his words as reported by Samuel is very natural, to say the least, and not just for unsophisticated readers like me. More than one of the experts I have consulted about translation issues concerning this passage claim that the Hebrew word translated here as "have made reckoning of," and in many other English translations as "have remembered," or even better in the translation that Elvin Planiga read, which had it as "will punish," and I guess that's in a few translations. All that supports my point. Long story short, concerning that particular word that gets translated in those ways, if a person or a people is wicked and God remembers or makes a reckoning of that wickedness, then bad things are going to happen to that person, and they're going to happen because of that person's wickedness. The suggestion of punishment is very strong, and the suggestion of an explanatory connection between the person's wickedness and the bad things that happen to that person is irresistible. Of course, it is compatible with taking the story literally to claim that God did not tell Samuel all of her reasons for her command. But it is not compatible with the literal reading to imply, as Stump's interpretation does, that God's own explanation for her actions is woefully and needlessly incomplete and seriously misleading. If the reasons for God's command that God wants to reveal to us in the story of Samuel and the Amalekites have nothing to do with punishment, have more to do with Israel than with Amalek, and have more to do with Amalek's present or even potential future transgressions than with Amalek's past transgressions, then the God of the story did an extraordinarily poor job of explaining his command. I conclude that Stump's interpretation does not really take the story literally, especially given the Eleonorean Christian view that the Bible is God's revelation, and so presumably successfully reveals something, especially when it quotes God. Stump might respond that to take the story in its entirety to be literally true, one need only accept as true every sentence in the story and every sentence that one knows to be logically or semantically entailed by those sentences. If this is her position, then that would explain why she feels free to suggest in one place, although this isn't part of her official interpretation, that perhaps the Amalekite children didn't suffer when they and their families were slaughtered. After all, she points out, the story doesn't explicitly say that they did suffer, and an omnipotent God could certainly prevent their suffering. One wonders, though, why such an interesting and important part of the history of the event would be omitted. It's not as if the authors, or author with a capital A, of the Bible was generally reticent to report miracles. Further, exegesis of this sort appears to lead to absurdity. For example, why stop with the children? Why not say that perhaps none of the Amalekites and none of their animals suffered? Indeed, perhaps the whole experience for both Israelite soldiers and the Amalekites was one of pure joy. An omnipotent God could certainly make this so, and nothing in the Bible explicitly denies that this was so. Add to that a happy afterlife for all involved, and one might conclude, problem solved. What is wrong with this, of course, is that such an interpretation is utterly implausible, even for an Eleonorean Christian. And part of the reason that it is implausible is that it takes the story literally only in a very impoverished sense of the word literally. This is not to reject all interpretations that do not take the story literally, nor is it to assume that Bible stories wear their meanings or all of their meanings on their sleeves. But it is to reject interpretations that are only pseudo-literal. The second of Stump's three claims is that accepting the interpretation does not require one to reject any deeply entrenched moral beliefs. Before I challenge this claim, I would like to point out how important it is that Stump feels the need to make it. She didn't say much about this in the version of the paper you heard today. It is explicitly discussed, however, in a longer version of the paper. There, Stump says that when we interpret Bible stories like the story of the Amalekites, we should not rethink our moral standards. For example, we should not, quote, for the sake of preserving traditional Jewish and Christian views about Revelation, be prepared to take genocide and the wholesale slaughter of animals as morally permissible, end quote. She continues, quote, there is something loathsome about a willingness to endorse anything at all as long as it lends support to religious practices or beliefs. So Stump is not interested in trying to reconcile Eleanorean Christianity with the literal truth of the story by saying, for example, that murder or genocide could in some cases be permissible, such as when God commands it, or perhaps even when one sincerely and unculpably, though mistakenly, believes that God commands it. That's the scary one. For her, if a Bible story implies that God commanded murder or genocide, then the story must be rejected. And the reason that it must be rejected is that we must not let our commitment to religious tradition or orthodoxy undermine our deeply entrenched moral belief that all human acts of murder and all human acts of genocide are wrong.